Hello, I'm Sally Davies here at the Fondation pour Cher, and I'm speaking to Ruth Macklin, Distinguished University Professor Emerita at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Ruth, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ruth, you're something of a living legend in bioethics. You've had an extraordinary decades-long career. You've published and spoken about subjects as diverse as surrogacy to HIV/AIDS. But I want to take us right back to the beginning and hear about how you first became interested in doing this kind of work.
Well, it was one of those things called serendipity. I was teaching philosophy in a philosophy department, and the focus at that time, let me say what the year was, all right? I got my PhD in 1968, so it's been a long career. And we were interested with what was popular at the time was philosophy of science. So I wrote some things in philosophy of science, and in this field, is one of the first articles that I wrote at someone's request was experimenting with human subjects, conducting medical experiments with human beings. And little did I know at the time that that would be my next career. So that was while I was still in a philosophy department. And there was a summer activity at some point in the philosophy department where a colleague had decided we should focus on something in what was then called medical ethics. Now it's called bioethics. And I got very interested in the field. And while we were discussing the issues in that field, the head of an organization that was completely devoted to the field of bioethics was there, sitting in the audience. And after my presentation, he came up and offered me a job. And I thought it was a surprise, and I didn't know if I wanted to leave a philosophy department and move from where I was living at the time in Ohio and move to New York to be in this. But I thought about it for 10 minutes and decided this is it. So I actually changed from general work in philosophy into the field of then medical ethics and bioethics.
What's extraordinary about your career is that not only have you witnessed amazing scientific changes and progress, but also huge social changes in terms of the perception of some of these issues. I'm curious to know, you've done a lot of work, both scholarly and also with international organisations on HIV/AIDS. What was it like to be working as a bioethicist at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis?
Well, that was actually quite interesting because there were controversial issues, and ethics is, of course, a controversial area. There are often people on two sides, or three sides maybe, of an argument or a situation. Much of that work, actually, that I did in HIV was connected with being right here in Geneva at the World Health Organization. I was invited, that was another serendipity, if I may call it. I was at a meeting, and the person who was then the head of the Department of Reproductive Health at WHO was in the audience. And he came up after my presentation and said, how would you like to come to Geneva to be involved in work there? So that of course, prompted my interest, and after that I came to Geneva more frequently. But the work in HIV started in ethics or bioethics. You have to be up to date in a way. That is, whatever is happening, the journals are interested in it, the more popular press is interested in it. And so when HIV was there were so many ethical issues raised by HIV/AIDS that became, I think the first article I wrote on HIV was in 1986. And the last one was in 2006. That's a lot of years to be writing on one topic, but of course I did other things in between. So much of my work has been seeing what's going on in the world. Now that I've got to my retirement, I wish I had more time to write about COVID. So the career looks at what's current in ethics, but current in the world. And the other area in which I worked that was current was women's health issues. And that became very interesting. Some of it was reproductive health, but not all of it.
And what are some of the principles or ideas that you've fought for, that you've been committed to over the course of your career?
Well, ethics is also connected with human rights. And human rights is a legal and international legal field, but you can talk about human rights even if you don't go into depth on what the issues are there. So much of what I was interested in was the rights of patients, so questions about informed consent. I looked over my curriculum vitae just before our interview here, and I saw how many articles I had written about informed consent. And that is informed consent for treatment and informed consent for research. So that was a very big topic for a long time, and it covers every field. And of course, as one who stands up for human rights and the rights of patients and research subjects, that was something that interested me. But it became controversial. And in fact, ethics is always controversial because people say, on the one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand. And so I was not afraid to take strong positions on topics in ethics and medicine.
One of the positions you've taken is to question cultural and ethical relativism. Could you expand upon that?
Well, relativism is an interesting issue. There are a lot of theories, I won't go into theory, but into ethical theories of various sort. And one is that there is one set of rules, a set of rights that are universal. Another way of thinking about it is that there are conclusions that one draws that should be universal throughout the world. Well, it doesn't quite work that way. People from the so-called developed countries, that is the richer countries, tend to think that their rules should be universal and everybody should follow them. But there are some people who say we have to respect the rights and the beliefs of people who live in developing countries, poorer countries, African countries. For example, my work took me to 14 African countries during that time. And you can imagine that even within Africa, there are different views. But my view is we are all human beings. And even if there are some practices or some beliefs in a variety of countries, we have to have something like a universal ethics that applies to human beings everywhere. After all, in some countries, even some developed countries, they don't have slavery anymore, but there are lack of respect for individuals who are poor, individuals who have impairments of some sort. And my view is we have to treat all human beings equally. So I have been a defender, and that's what human rights are about. So that's why part of my work has been in human rights. I'm a defender of the human rights of people all over the world. And so the title of my article was, and a book that I wrote, was Against Relativism. That meant that the same ethical principles should apply to poor people, to minorities, different circumstances in different countries in the world. And of course, that's a controversial view, because there are others who say, well, we got to respect the way that some countries have come to be developed, and some people in minority groups have different ethical issues, but we're all human beings. So it was basically that view, and there's still controversy over ethical relativism, as it's called.
You've talked about your work on human rights and women's human rights, and it strikes me that, again, over the course of your career, you've seen the advent of second wave feminism and women's liberation. On the other hand, now in developed countries, we're to some extent seeing the rollback of some of these successes or forms of progress. How do you respond to that as a bioethicist, and are you fundamentally optimistic or concerned about the future of women's human rights?
Well, I'm concerned. And I'm concerned because this is the interface of ethics as a world practice and to all human beings and all countries, and politics. So what we're seeing now in very many countries, in European countries, as well as certainly in the United States, it's a movement away from liberalism to a very much more stringent, sort of old-fashioned idea. And if you believe in relativism, then you can't really argue for something like human rights, because human rights applies to everyone, throughout the world. So my own work, which in my own political views, I would call myself a liberal, certainly, but one has to make arguments when there are governmental laws. One very obvious example is rolling back the right to abortion, which has occurred now recently in the United States. And ironically, just as more developing countries have begun to enable women to have abortions. So there's an intertwining or interlacing of ethics and politics, and that occurs and that affects lots of what goes on, both in, not only in universities, but in ordinary life.
So one of the themes to emerge from our conversation, it seems to me, is how bioethics is always involved in the business of horizon scanning and speaking to the hot button issues of the day. I'm curious to know, what are some of the emerging technologies or concerns within bioethics that you're training your sites on now?
Well, of course, artificial intelligence, we can't ignore that. But it's very recent, and although I'm extremely interested in it, I haven't yet gone into that in depth. But I'll give you two examples. One that is really quite recent, and that is the phenomenon of transgender. That is, there have been, in some countries, but not all countries, a recognition of people who are gay men and gay women. But more recently, the idea of changing one's gender, because as medicine has advanced, surgery and hormones can actually change the gender or the sex, whichever way you put it, of people. So most recently, I've co-authored an article with a bioethicist from Mexico on that topic, and we are having trouble getting that article published because it's so controversial. And in some past controversial areas, if you're speaking in one way about HIV or about abortion, you take that into stride and writing it. But this is very, very brand new. And other issues over the years that I've engaged in have involved an intertwining. Abortion is another example of politics and how that changes, and one has to make ethical arguments, which are different, of course, from whatever the political norms are that are functioning. And in the past, there were controversies over HIV. When HIV patients began to be admitted to hospitals, medical doctors and nurses who were afraid of acquiring HIV, AIDS, for example, they would bring the trays and leave the patient's trays outside the door, not enter the door. So there was a lot of discussion during the entire, as I mentioned, I've wrote articles for 20 years on HIV, and the controversies really were how medical doctors have obligations to their patients. And of course, there were some very, very brave medical doctors. I sat on ethics committees at the hospitals and the institutions where I worked. And you can imagine the controversy over where some doctors were saying, we can't risk our lives and get AIDS, because early on there was no treatment for AIDS. And others were saying, this is your profession. Go do another profession if you're not going to come in and take care of patients. So there was always controversy swirling around doctors' obligations, risks to themselves in certain ways. And this was the case in the developing countries that I visited as well.
Are there any positions you've taken in the field of bioethics that you've fundamentally changed your mind about, that you've been persuaded to adopt the point of view of the other side?
No, but I am going to give you one example. And it's an example that is, there's a popular word in ordinary language, dignity. And I want to just speak about that briefly because this was an area of my work, and I actually wrote 2 articles on dignity, a very, very contentious one, an argumentative one, and then I softened it a little bit in another article.
And to clarify, this was
Yes.
this was you were taking a critical view of the notion of dignity.
Yes,
you didn't think it was particularly
I was just going
useful.
to, well, may I tell the little anecdote that happened?
Of course.
I was at a conference and I had given a talk, and there's always questions from the audience afterwards, and I love that part because it's important not only what bioethicists think and what doctors think and nurses and people in the profession, but of course it's important about what ordinary citizens, I don't mean ordinary in a bad word, but people in life, what they think about. So there was a question and answer period, and I answered the questions. And one person from the audience, a woman, stood up and she said, isn't there a principle in bioethics about dignity, human dignity? And what came out of my mouth without my brain working was, dignity is a useless concept. That was the most controversial thing I ever said. And of course, people were horrified in the audience, not just that woman. After my lecture, the editor of the British Medical Journal, which is a very widespread and highly recognized journal, came running up the aisle to me, and he said, will you write an article for us on dignity? And I said, gee, I don't know anything about it. I just know that I think the concept is a foolish concept or unidentified or unexplicated. So I agreed. I wrote the article, and it was just one of these 2-page articles in a very big medical journal. There's nothing else I ever wrote in the field of bioethics that had so much opposition and so much negative response. But I tried to defend it essentially by saying dignity is used in so many different ways, and there are other ways to be more precise. So what is dignity? How do we know what dignity is? Is it the clothing you're wearing? Is it the way you treat people, etc.? So I got more opposition to that 2-page article than anything else that I wrote. And I did write controversial things in bioethics, but the people who responded were other bioethicists. This was doctors responded and other people responded. So I became kind of famous for that. But afterwards, I was invited to another conference and invited to say something more. And I decided, well, I better give a little better explanation than just saying it's a useless concept. So I did, and I softened my view, but I didn't change my view. I don't use that word in my writings or even in my ordinary speech. But that was really the one, I would say, negative thing. Other bioethicists, of course, agreed with what I said because there are controversies within the field, but this was something that involves the general population because everybody talks a little bit about dignity. But I did soften my view a little bit in another article that I wrote.
Why do you think people are so attached to the concept of dignity? Why were they so reluctant to give it up?
I really can't say what the answer is to that. That's a very interesting question. I think it's because so many people in the world, in one way or another, are treated badly. I'm thinking of all the racism that has existed throughout the world, and certainly in the United States with slavery. And I can say that even today in the United States, there are a lot of problems with the black population. And what we're seeing now, just to use another example, is in religion. The attacks on religion, what's going on certainly in Israel today, contemporary affairs. So the idea of dignity is basically saying this is a concept that should apply to all human beings. I think back also to the Holocaust as an example of people who the Jews, of course, because of their religion, were killed, 6 million of them. So human dignity is allegedly a concept that applies. Now, I just think there are better ways of talking about human rights, for example, is clearer because it's a legal concept as well as an ethical concept. How you treat people, there are moral rights as well as legal rights. So if one believes in the equality of human beings, regardless of race, religion, or other factors like disabilities, which is also my view, because a lot of the way disabled people were treated, and in some culture today, they're still kept in the house, put in the basement, etc., if they have mental disabilities or physical disabilities. So my view has always been one of equality and respect for persons. That's one of the principles in bioethics, and principle as applied in bioethics, respect for persons means you have to get their informed consent, and you don't operate on them if you don't get their informed consent. And certainly in experimentation you should get their informed consent, and of course, as we know, during the Second World War and the Nazi era, there was no informed consent for the people who were subjected to the Nazi experiments. So I think dignity is one way of talking about it, but I would actually prefer to talk about it in the way of human rights. Not to be subjected to something against your will, not to be treated in medicine against your will, the right to refuse treatment. And there are some little exceptions to that. I'll give one example of controversy. The right of pregnant women to be treated without their consent. Because if there's something in an illness where there would be, although women want to refuse a treatment, and they're looking at the fetus and how the question of whether you should force a woman to get a treatment for some kind of ailment that she has that would jeopardize the health of the fetus. But if you believe in human rights and the right to refuse medical treatment, then that should be a right for pregnant women just as anything else. And because not yet, there are not any pregnant men yet, but there is a saying that goes around that if men became pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. Well, that's a silly statement, but it also has to do with the treatment of women in medicine as well as in other ways in the world.
I mean, transgender men can become pregnant, of course, although this hasn't necessarily led to this sort of social transformation in the rights of
But of course, that's
people.
very recent. And what we're seeing in the United States is laws in the very conservative states, mostly the southern states. Laws are now being passed in the southern states that are banning, actually prohibiting transsexual activities. In other words, trying to change the sex of a human being. So I think in general we're seeing the world, I know this is true in some European countries as well, becoming more conservative in various ways, and this has a lot of impact in medical treatment as well as other areas of life.
You mentioned concern for persons and human rights as being a strong imperative in your career. I wonder what you make of some recent attempts within the field of bioethics to link questions of bioethics to questions of planetary health, and is there an argument to say that bioethics needs to expand its focus beyond persons to capture the health of non-human animals, even potentially biological systems that aren't animals? I'm curious for your take on that, Ruth.
There has always been an attention to animals, particularly in experimentation. So the question of how animals are treated and what kinds of treatment and experiments you can do and how you do experiments on animals. It's actually quite interesting because some people have claimed that the animals have more rights than some people have. But of course, animals can't give consent. But that is a part, people who work in the field of bioethics can have a sub-area of interest that it may be called animal rights, but some very well-known bioethicists have worked in the area of research involving animals, and not only research. But we now have environmental ethics. And environmental ethics is actually now talking about the planetary point. And whether it's part of bioethics or not, there are just controversy. I don't consider these controversial issues. Why not have an open mind and say anything that's going to upgrade? Because obviously talking about environmental ethics involves the effects on human beings. It's not only the environment's not human, but there are effects and consequences for human beings. So the more recent areas, but there was even controversy within the field of bioethics about whether public health ethics should be considered part of bioethics. So, these are more advanced controversies within the field, not so much for the world at large and for the general population. And there were a couple of people who worked in ethics in public health who said, we're not going to publish in the bioethics journals, we want our own journal. So the Journal of Public Health Ethics was founded. My view is I'm a little more open-minded. I think anything that involves ethics can be brought, in the same arena, and people have specialties. After all, there are the academics who teach it have academic specialties because you have to read the literature, and the literature has grown in this field and bioethics generally to the point where most people working in the field have to have a sub-area or subcategory. So, for example, I would not attempt to write in environmental ethics because I would have to read so many articles in books that I'd probably be close to my deathbed before I finished. So you develop a specialty for partly out of interest and partly out of the need to confine your intellectual work so that you can write something even for the general public in a field that people are interested in.
Ruth, thank you. I think that's a lovely note on which to end, a call for bioethics being a broad church. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.